My pleasure to introduce the moderator for the next session, and that's Alyssa Gilbert. Alyssa is the Director of Innovation at the Grantham Institute and Director of Undaunted, which is the Grantham Institute at Imperial College's Innovation Centre in collaboration with the Royal Institution, which is doing remarkably well, and I'm sure Alyssa would like to speak to anyone who wants to know more about that at lunchtime, which is coming up after this and the next session. I'm just going to hand over to Alyssa, and she's going to tell us about the CORE programme. Thank you. Alyssa.
Okay, great. Thanks, Martin. So I do a few different things at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial, and one of them is playing a role in CORE, which is the Greenhouse Gas Removal Hub. I'll tell you a little bit about that now, and then my colleagues Joe and Evangelos are going to tell you a little bit more detail about some of the findings that we've had on the project. So the UK government has invested over £30 million from the UK-RE funds, so that's research money, into looking at greenhouse gas removal in general. And that money has been split over 6 projects. And together, these 6 projects make a kind of a hub. So these projects include 5 what are called demonstrator projects. The demonstrator projects are actually 5 or 6 year long now experimental projects that are looking at each at a different greenhouse gas removal technology and really trying to study and understand how the technologies work in situ in several different locations in the UK. And each of those projects have been formulated by their own team and also include engagement activities with communities. Sometimes that's communities of farmers, communities of practice in those different areas. And from that project, we're learning a lot about the technical potential of these different technologies, what makes good rollout happen, how much greenhouse gas removal can we expect from them, and what considerations should the UK government take into account if we're going to scale these technologies in different parts of the UK. So the 5 what we call demonstrator projects cover Net Zero Plus, which is actually led by a PI here at Exeter University, which is looking at afforestation and reforestation. There's a biochar demonstrator, there's an enhanced rock weathering demonstrator, there's a peatland restoration demonstrator, and there's one on perennial biomass crops. And as I said, each of them have sites in many different parts of the UK. And then in addition to that, UK-RE funded the CORE project, which is what the 3 of us are working on. And the purpose of the CORE project is to also do academic research, but into the common dimensions that cut across any type of greenhouse gas removal project or enterprise. Okay, this is the team, but just to show you that this project includes people from a range of different universities in the UK, Imperial, Oxford, Bristol, Manchester, Leeds, and Edinburgh. So that means that the people doing the research are also based in different parts of the country. And there's a few different areas and dimensions that different people are leading on. The role of the project is to coordinate with all those demonstrators and to do research, as I said, on those multidisciplinary aspects of greenhouse gas removal that aren't looked at by the individual projects and are relevant regardless of technology. Importantly, we also have a role to bring together not just the outcomes from the demonstrator projects, but the outcomes from other greenhouse gas removal programs that were invested in by the UK government. So as well as these 5 really big demonstrator projects, the UK also put seed funding into a range. It's over 20 projects in the UK, many of which are much more engineered removals than the ones that I've showed you here that are mainly land-based. And that's just coincidence, they're spread. But we're trying to bring together findings from all of those together. Didn't know this was animated, but lots of different icons. Okay, so here is when we talk about the multidisciplinary research areas that we're looking at in the core bit of the project. These are the work packages that we have, and they give you some idea of the things that we're investigating. And some of these touch upon some aspects that the previous speaker was talking about in terms of socially responsible innovation. So the first one is to try and think about what a clear strategic vision for GGR might look like for the UK, and that's to inform policymakers at all different levels. And for that, we do a lot of, I'll show you in a second, a lot of activities to bring together the findings from the demonstrators and those research project investments. The second is to understand and investigate what socially robust GGR development looks like, and that includes quite a lot of social science investigation along the lines of what we heard about earlier this morning, which includes working with a range of communities and doing social science research at a number of levels. We're looking a little bit at what how we could bring down technology costs. So there's an innovation dimension to the project as well, where we're supporting some innovators through a separate strand of activity. We have a work package on looking at policies and governance, and a detailed work package looking at monitoring, reporting, and verification, which Joe will be speaking about in a second. And importantly, we also have some decision support tools from the project to help different levels of governance make good decisions about choosing and supporting greenhouse gas removal projects. It has stopped moving. Is that just me? Oh, no. It worked. Pointed it correctly. All right, so we have lots of different outputs from the project, and I'd encourage you, if you're interested, you can look at the website to find out a little bit more. Of course, it's a research project, so we have lots of papers, and the papers are really, really varied. So some of them are about the framing, so what do we mean by net zero and how can we get it right? Some of them are really looking at quantifying what we can get from different greenhouse gas removal technologies. We've had policy, so I know you had a discussion earlier on the carbon take-back obligation. We've had discussions on different policy levers, both at the macro level, like the carbon take-back obligation would be in terms of market creation, but also at the very detailed level to manage things like legal liability, for example. So we've got a whole legal work stream as well. Importantly, because we want to help bridge the gap between the research and decisions that are made about research, we've also been quite active in producing briefings, reports, and submissions, particularly to government consultations. So some of those consultations have been very detailed. Sometimes we're asked things about very specific technologies and how they should be implemented. Or, for example, there was a government consultation on how should greenhouse gas removals be included in the EU emissions trading system. That's a really specific question. And we've got relevant research, and we fed that in. At the other end of the spectrum, right now, the government is undertaking an independent review on its approach to greenhouse gas removal, and we've put in a very elaborate response to that draws upon all of the areas of research. So we've been spending quite a lot of the time responding to these kinds of opportunities throughout the 5 years of the research program. Also, notably, the team led by the group at Oxford have published an annual report, which is the state and trends of carbon dioxide removal. And that actually is an international look at the opportunities, the risks, and the kind of ways that we should manage greenhouse gas removal globally, but it includes a lot of the information that we're learning from our project here. We've also had quite a lot of engagement events, so throughout the program, throughout the project, we've been liaising. We've had some big events, and if you're interested, we're having another big event at the end of the project in September, at the very end of September, where we'll be talking about our research findings, and then we'll also be having a pitch day for the innovators that we've supported in the project on the last day. So that's a real chance to get up to speed with all of the information. We've also been having a series of webinars that are really targeting particular parts of the policy community. So throughout the 4.5 years of the project, we've been working quite closely with people from the Environment Agency, people from local councils, a range of NGOs, which really span the gamut from NGOs who are proponents of CDR through to NGOs who are very concerned about it. So bringing those people together throughout the journey and helping them sort of co-create our outputs, but also at this point also sharing with them our findings. So we've been, for example, there's a research module on business models. So that's a really challenging part for greenhouse gas removal because at the moment there's no really solid source of demand. And our research has shown that you need different policies for different stages of greenhouse gas removal development. And we've been engaging quite a lot with different actors in the public and private sector to talk about how you can, what kind of business models you need, what those look like along the supply chain, and what roles different actors, including governments, but also others, can be playing to make those markets work. And so we've had a kind of online session sharing those findings and allowing conversation between those actors. So those are different things that we've been doing throughout the project. We also have an additional pot of funding in this project that we use to stimulate a range of other activities outside the original project. And that includes a bit of seed funding for additional original research, and that's gone to places like novel chemical technologies, really in the lab still. It's gone to projects on marine carbon dioxide removal, which was a kind of relatively new area untouched by our project. But we've also had a flexible fund available for art projects related to greenhouse gas removal, many of which are just starting to be made available now. And we created a Future Leaders Network of a range of younger people emerging in the public sector, in academia, and in the private sector, who we think will really be important to taking this agenda forward. And all of these things we've been building throughout the 4.5 years of the project. I'm going to finish with this final slide and then pass over to Joe. In the first couple of years of the project, one of the things that we thought was very important was to build a comprehensive evaluation framework that helped us understand what makes greenhouse gas removal, what makes good greenhouse gas removal. We built a framework together with a range of stakeholders that touched upon all of the elements that you can see here. Does it actually remove greenhouse gases? What impact did it have on the environment more widely? What's the kind of social engagement dimensions? And very much moving beyond that paradigm of social acceptance, as you said, and moving really towards the idea that we need to work in place-based context with the local communities, and particularly more recent findings, even at the level of field trials, to understand that our research is actually building local understanding of the issues and building that into what we're doing. So the social dimension is really important. Thinking about how it integrates with the rest of the system. There's lots of supply chain issues and value chain issues involved in this area of work. Looking at the business models, as I said, and the legal dimensions. So for the first couple of years, this framework has been really important in binding all of the different research that we're doing at CORE together and in creating practical tools that can be used by people in the GGR community or potentially future in the GGR community. So I'm going to hand over to Joe now, who's going to talk about the evaluation framework and the MRV dimension in more detail.
Thank you. Yeah, so what we've done in the project is we turned what's the slide Alyssa just showed into this slightly more user-friendly slide here. So the idea is, with our evaluation framework, is we've got these dimensions that are to do with sustainability. They're to do with the carbon, the greenhouse gases, but also the environment. Looking beyond carbon at the environment is really key. It's key for public acceptability, and also the social impacts connecting with the SDGs. And then you've got this kind of broader, overarching regulatory frameworks, business models, monitoring, reporting and verification. So how you make all that happen, how you make it happen in a credible way. There was a lot of talk yesterday about whenever there's risk and uncertainty, it makes investors nervous. Trust was mentioned quite a lot yesterday, and so all of this is really about trust. It's how we build something credible, how we build something that looks at multiple dimensions, that isn't just focused on the carbon, that does what's needed. In fact, we're talking about how we feel. I feel a bit like carbon police. Sometimes I feel a bit hopeful from all the projects that were presented yesterday, but I also feel very nervous. Walking into their conference, something called New Carbon Economy, sounds a little bit scary. Where is all this going? Is it more just greenwashing? There's a lot of carbon cowboys out there. There's a lot of greenwashing. I feel confident that everyone in the room who spoke yesterday is here for a genuine reason. I don't feel confident that that's everyone that's out there. I have a lot of nervousness, but I feel that what our job is within CORE and the work we're doing is to make sure that what we're doing is credible. And it's really important to do that now, right? Because if we don't do it now, then we lose confidence in the whole system, and everything we're all talking about, no one will buy or invest in or have any trust in. So number one for trust is it has to be really properly greenhouse gas net negative over the whole supply chain. So this is the minimal standard. You have to take the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. You have to put them somewhere where they're going to be stored. You have to look across the whole supply chain, so not just the bit that takes it out and then whatever you need to build an infrastructure in order to do the project and transport and everything, all the way through to storage. There's going to be emissions and removals all across that supply chain. We need to make sure we're net negative across the supply chain. And Stephanie, you still said something earlier about if you do the take-back obligation, you don't need to look at supply chain because you're confident that you're net negative across the supply chain. I would say you should always be looking at the supply chain because you should always be looking at ways to innovate across the whole supply chain and not just think, okay, it's net negative at the production end, we don't need to worry about the rest. So net negative across the whole supply chain. all very good when you've got a single small project. What happens when you start scaling up? So one single project, if you think about some of the projects that were talked about in the last couple of days, something on a farm, you're doing something great for soil, you might be planting some trees. That's all very good when it's a single project. When you start to scale that up, then there's a big problem. And when we brought out the IPCC report last time, there was a lot about some of the scenarios in that talking about covering an area the size of India in bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. IPCC isn't saying to do that. IPCC scenarios are answering the questions of what might we need to do to get carbon neutral. And that's one of the things you could do. It's not saying it's the right thing. And really BECS in that is just... It's there to represent a lot of CDRs. It doesn't matter that we've talked about a lot of CDR approaches that aren't included in those scenarios. It's just saying this is the scale at which we would need to do stuff. And if you're doing it all on the land, that's actually going to create lots of other problems. So when we scale up, we need to really start thinking about co-benefits and the trade-offs. We need to start thinking about beyond that project. Is it displacing food production elsewhere? If we do this here, do we need to cut down forests somewhere else to produce food? Those are all considerations that you need to think about. And then you need to think about alternative scenarios. What might have happened to that land if I didn't do this project? So you need to think about the counterfactuals. And this stuff is complicated, right? Because it crosses boundaries. In the UK, we're importing pellets from Canada to use in DRAX, which will eventually be a carbon capture and storage system. And so there's lots of cross boundaries there geographically, there's cross boundaries over time. So getting some kind of harmonisation across those boundaries, understanding how you can then compare single projects to each other is really key to this. So, yeah, carbon police. I work on measuring, reporting and verification. My granddad was a financial accountant. Now I feel like I'm a carbon accountant. But I also like to think that I've been quite influenced by a lot of our social science colleagues, some of the amazing artists in residence we have in the project. But you know, why is this sort of apparently quite boring subject that I've really got really interesting and entrenched in important, and it's important for trust and credibility. None of what we do gets anywhere without this trust. We have to be able to show transparently what we're doing in order to build confidence and trust in it. And we have to be honest about it because there are lots of uncertainties. There are lots of risks. We can't hide that. The public are smarter than we think. There's already a lot of mistrust out there for carbon dioxide removal, the sense that we're trying to let people get off with carrying on emitting. So it's really important to be transparent. It's really important to share data. And it's also really important to do this piece where we think beyond carbon to the environmental and social impacts. And not just as an add-on, right? This should be embedded. So at the moment, a lot of the accounting, a lot of the IPCC methodologies that I work on for national greenhouse gas emissions and removals accounting, it's all just based on the greenhouse gases. It's not taking account, it's not embedding centrally these broader environmental issues. For a lot of projects, this is dealt with as an add-on, a sort of sustainability tick box. Oh, our project's sustainable. Oh, it achieves 2 of the SDGs. You know, it's quite vague wording like that, you know. So how can we embed this properly? And how can we have consistency and comparability across different types of CDR approaches so that an investor can really look, oh, I'm going to invest in this or I'm going to invest in that. We're not saying what's right or wrong. We're providing the information so they can go, well, I actually like this one with these add-ons where they're doing something about flood or this one with those, but having all the information available. And, you know, this is urgent, right? There's loads of uncertainties. I'm a scientist. I like to talk about uncertainties and then ask for more funding to reduce those uncertainties. That's kind of part of the job description. But actually, we also need to crack on and do things. So we need to do this learning by doing. And there is embedded within that, within the IPCC methods, you can update them within the Article 6.4 methods. So to go on for that and talking about methods, there's this huge tangled web of stuff out there that we need to deal with that makes the kind of regulatory and investor confidence very, very challenging. There are these 5 principles of MRV that are accepted by the UNFCCC and adopted by various governments looking at this, which is accuracy, transparency, consistency, comparability, and completeness. And one day I'll remember all 5 of those without needing to read them off my slide. So these are the fundamental principles. And then what have we got going on? At the international level, you've got greenhouse gas inventories produced by the IPCC, the methods for doing this nationally. At the moment, they include things like what happens when you plant forests. So they include that kind of CDR. They include peatlands and soils. They include biochar more recently. They don't have enhanced rock weathering. They don't have anything on any of the ocean enhancement techniques. There's a proposal currently to governments to update the next round of updates to the IPCC inventories to include all of these. If this is your bag and you're a bit carbon policey like me, you can apply to join that and make sure your methods are well represented. If you're not, please look at that when it comes out for stages of review and input to that. Also internationally, we've got Article 6.4, which is the bit of the Paris Agreement that deals with kind of carbon trading and carbon credits across borders. And the Article 6, it's a 6.4, it's like the Clean Development Mechanism. It's a market-based instrument for doing this kind of carbon trading voluntarily. They've just brought out approved standards on methodologies. They've got a standard on activities, including removals, approved at the COP. In May, they adopted a standard on baseline and leakage. And they're still looking at revised methods for individual CDR approaches. So that's also going on at the international level. At national level, here in the UK, our government, Department for Energy and Net Zero, have commissioned the British Standards Institute to look at developing methods for greenhouse gas removal. At the moment, we have minimum quality thresholds due out in July on BECCS and DACs. And then the more detailed methods will come out, and then it will be expanded to other greenhouse gas removals technologies. There's also standards being developed on nature market and principles and nature-based carbon benefits and various other things. So that's where we're at in the UK. In the European Union, they've got the carbon I can't remember the acronym. CRCF, carbon farming. It's written on there, I can't quite read it. Carbon removals and carbon farming principles, and they're also looking at methods. These are quite kind of top-down approaches. In the US, it's more of a bottom-up approach to what's going on at the moment. And then you've got all the mess of the voluntary carbon markets where there's loads and loads going on. And this was from the State of the CDR report Alyssa mentioned, and just to really say there's lots of principles out there. There's more methods for the more conventional CDR. Some of it's really lacking. What's really lacking is anything that looks at where you put 2 CDR methods together. Quite a lot of people talked about combining biochar and other things. In terms of what we need to ensure that storage really happens and it's permanent, but that's not fungible, right? Geological storage is for thousands of years. Biological storage, it's complicated, it's affected by management, it's affected by climate change, there's lots of uncertainties. There's differences also in terms of the accuracy of measurements, the ability to show something's additional, that it's really anthropogenic. And there's also differences in terms of the co-benefits. So you need to look at each CDR on its own. But to pick up on the carbon take-back obligation, our view is that only geological removals really are equivalent to fossil emissions. And so should it be something we say? You can only, pay for geological storage and then consider you net zero. And biological should only offset food production. And we could say that, but could that stifle innovation and could it stop money flow? But is that money flow into biological systems just for carbon? Is that also quite damaging because it's not emphasising the broader use of that land and importance of that land to people? There's a whole trade-off that I don't have time to go through with accuracy and pragmatism and the costs of CDR and whether you go for something that's very, very precise and accurate but is actually expensive and really, really hard to implement. If you go for the minimum standards or the gold standard, and there's still a lot going on in this space, and I hope that you would be flexible actually to improve as you go along. And it's expensive to do at this MRV, so we want to be reducing the costs. Something key to this is about data sharing at an early stage. Be transparent. Can it be such that projects only get money for doing CDR removal if they are going to be transparent and share their data and that there's a data sharing agreement, and we'd really push for that. So I am going to just slip to some more take-home messages. We need to consider engineered and biological-based CDR up by consistent principles, but we also need to recognise that they are not totally fungible, they're not totally equivalent. We need to embed flexibility so we can learn by doing. We need to reward early adopters for transparency and data sharing, and we need to just crack on and do this, but do it well and transparently so we don't lose trust. I'm going to hand over to Evangelos now.
Well, thanks, Joe. I'm Evangelos, and I'm just going to dive a bit more into MRV, practicalities, scalability issues, and standardization. So you can see here a report from the state of CDR showing all the different CDR technologies we're having at the moment. A few of them are very well known, like afforestation, soil carbon sequestration, but we have a range of different novel technologies. You can also see the technology readiness levels as well, which is directly linked to MRV, showing actually how ready we are to deploy. And you can also see on the graph that after 2020, we're having a boom of different MRV protocols being actually available in the voluntary carbon markets, and most of them are focusing now on the novel CDR technologies. So this is the landscape at the moment. We're having land-based and nature-based technologies, but also marine carbon dioxide removal technologies, and all these different registries and projects across the globe. Here you can see that at the moment they have been generated or sold about 200 million carbon credits so far, and most of them, which is actually 100 million carbon credits, are from forestation and soil carbon sequestration and peatlands, and all of the other novel technologies are now in a very, very early stages. And on the graphs, you can actually see that we have this shift of focus into explore all these new technologies. So you can see that most of the carbon registers are putting a lot of their R&D focus on putting out a different range of MRV protocols because there is no silver bullet actually. So we're exploring which different CDR technology fits to different project in different country or different geological or geographical setting. So afforestation, it's very well known, and we know where the projects are based, mostly on the global south, South America, Africa, and Asia. And we know the standards. It's Vera, Plan Vivo, and the Woodland Carbon Code in the UK. So we pretty much have a very, very good understanding of the MRV data that are being produced for tree planting and restoration projects. But moving on to the novel technologies, I'm just gonna give a few examples, including enhanced rock weathering and biochar. So enhanced rock weathering, with the Bristol team, we have actually did a stakeholder mapping last year, and we found out that at the moment there are 30 MRV protocols available, and only the 17 of them are actually having the ability to verify through an external verificator and, in theory, produce carbon credits. Practically, we have only one example of our production of carbon credits, which was isometric with a Plan Vivo a few months ago in a project in Brazil. Similarly, we're having synergies of enhanced rock weathering, like carbon mineralization. A lot of things have been covered previously and yesterday. So we're having different applications like in mining waste, construction waste, direct air capture, wastewater treatment, ocean alkalinity, carbon absorbing build materials, and also raw materials. Again, we're having a range of different protocols with different terminologies and different approaches. And for biochar, again, 50 entries globally, but interestingly, only 4 MRV protocols are having a detailed methodology for carbon capture and sequestration of the biochar deployment. So in all these maps, you can see that most of the research is taking place in the global north and Australia, and less in Africa, Asia or South America, where most of the projects are being deployed due to land availability mostly and lower MRV costs. That's between us. A bit more information about scalability issues. That's a very, very good example I like on enhanced rock weathering. I'm a geologist as well, so I do like geology. So the science behind enhanced rock weathering is simple. Changes on the pH are changing the carbon form we're having. So low pH, we're having carbonic acid, dissolved carbon. Around neutral pH, we're having bicarbonate in dissolved form, which is a short-term storage of carbon, and carbonic acid in high pHs. So the science is very, very well demonstrated with a range of papers. That's not new, that's very, very old. And then I'm giving 2 examples of the graphs there to show you that from the lab to the actual deployment on the land, we're having a huge difference of the data we're getting. So in a controlled lab-based experiments, in ideal conditions, we're having high weathering rates and high precipitation rates for carbon, but when we're applying this simple science in the field, we're having very, very lower precipitation rates and dissolution rates, which actually creates a problem in the generation of carbon credits. So in geology and soil science in general, we're having a lot of different standards for sampling and testing in the lab, but we have no standards on how we can standardize a carbon dioxide removal protocol in the field. So this is a range of different methods that we need to measure on the field, like gas phase, liquid phase, and solid phase, in order to understand how the system works long term, not just in a couple of days. And actually, data from different field trials in journal papers are actually showing that we're having a lot of issues in identifying enhanced rock weathering signals. We're getting different data and high uncertainty data in measuring the liquid phase, the solid phase, or the gaseous phase in the experiments. And different deployments in different places in the world with different soils, different feedstocks, and obviously different climatic conditions produce different data. So although the science is clear and the MRV protocols might be simple to deploy, the outcomes are completely different, and therefore we need a more holistic approach to understand how the system works long term, and most importantly, how the ecosystems react to long-term deployment in terms of the co-benefits, but also the potential negative side effects. Same example for biochar. In a closed system, we have a range of standards for pyrolysis, the production of biochar, but we do have nothing in terms of biochar deployment in the soil. So again, we need to measure pretty much everything. You can see different chemical characteristics here and physical characteristics that we need to measure in order to ensure permanence. And since the permanence for biochar is more than 100 years. We don't have enough data, so we're having lab-based methods which are pretty much expensive, like the decay curve or the internetine fraction calculation that we're having here, which again are giving us indications of potential permanence of biochar, but we don't have the data to secure the findings. It's just lab data. So that's why we need the field trials. In the core project, you see that we're having different demonstrators in different areas of the UK, including obviously Scotland and Wales. It's very interesting to let you know that we're working together with the scientists, and they're following the approach that we don't know how the system works, so we measure everything. So we're having a huge range of different data, geochemical, mineralogical, even microbial data or soil and water quality data. So we're putting all this information, all these data sets together in order to understand how the ecosystems work, not only focusing on the removals, but also focusing on the long-term deployment and the co-benefits. A few more information about standardization and research projects in the European Union. So in 2020, we had the first round of Horizon 2020 projects, so the NEGEM and the two sister projects actually setting the scene for carbon dioxide removal in the European Union. And in 2022, a new level of projects have been started, which was thinking, which I'm also working on, which is focusing on standardization for markets, carbon markets in the European Union, and also field trials. We're having the CO2 project, which is focusing on ocean CDR, and I think Christopher has mentioned some information tomorrow. And we also have the uptake project, which mostly is getting information from the other two projects and is working on business models. So most of the grant proposals have been written like 5 years ago with no policy and no standards back then for carbon dioxide removal. So the first idea was that to make the difference between the voluntary carbon markets and the compulsory carbon markets, we had to avoid the external verificator, which is also a company from the private sector. So in CISING, we were following the approach of the ISO 9000 in order to make sure that all the projects are self-verified, and we're working on 3 levels of standardization. Level 1, like the IPCC, which is a very, very general guidance for any CDR project. A level 2 guidance, which is on each specific CDR technology. And a level 3 quality management system, which is actually deployment-specific guidance, including an LCA analysis and also co-benefits and monitoring and permits for the environmental quality. So in CISING, we're having, similar to core, different technologies like afforestation, BECCS, biochar, enhanced weathering, artificial soils, and biological CO2 fixation, different deployments across Europe, and similar to core, we're collecting data in order to create a standardized version of MRV protocols for the European Union, and also polish our MRV approaches. So the take-home messages for both projects is that to date, CDR research and development is dominated by the voluntary carbon markets with all these MRV protocols. This is really good because we have more information coming, but also we're having low transparency and a lot of gray literature, which makes data interpretation very, very hard and creates a little bit of issues and overpromises in terms of the long-term deployment. So we need to have a really, really robust MRV methodologies with clear definitions of baselines, system boundaries, the monitoring parameters that they're key for the successful deployment of the project, and also, most importantly, clear timescales of deployment, either for permanence or storage. Obviously, more information for any field trials and case studies is welcome because we need the new data feed to update and validate our models. And in terms of policy, as Joe said earlier, we were having now the first steps in the UK and the EU in terms of standardization for CDR. Obviously, we're having a start on engineering systems like BECS and DACS because they're closed systems and it's easier to monitor and standardize. And next, and very, very promising technologies are enhanced rock weathering and biochar, both in the UK through DESNAS and DEFRA, but also in the European Union through the CRCF expert groups, and also in the new IPCC inventories. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we've got time for probably one question before I'm told we have to get off stage. So, anyone, question?
What's grey literature?
Well, I guess non-peer-reviewed, so peer-reviewed academic literature, but there's lots of other kind of technical studies that are done as well that would fit in that bucket. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess a general question for Joan Evangelos. How do you call for transparency, you highlighted the issues with MRV. Yeah, there are already companies out there selling credits, particularly with enhanced rock weathering and so many of the other techniques. How do you balance what's happening already in terms of the market with the needs that you're rightly highlighting from us academics?
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation at a meeting with a guy who said, we were talking about uncertainty in the soil. Someone mentioned yesterday about the need for the number of measurements and the need for time and how difficult it is. And he went, well, I'm already selling credits, so it's fine. And I go, what? Hang on a minute, just because you're selling credits, it doesn't mean you're selling good credits or what you're doing is really having the impact you need. So, yeah, it's really challenging. And there is this Wild West out there and money is being exchanged and we don't have trust and confidence. I don't have trust and confidence and I work in it, but I'm also hearing from a lot of projects where people are really trying to do the right thing. All you can do is improve. We are where we're at. It's moving really fast. The markets are moving faster than the regulation. We can just try and catch up and we can try and improve things and learn by doing as we go along. I don't know if you want to say anything different about that.
Yeah, I just think that the data that we're having from the voluntary carbon markets are good, but I think the elephant in the room is that it's the term is carbon capture and storage or sequestration. We can demonstrate carbon capture, obviously. It's something that takes place now or in a few minutes or in a day, but we can't demonstrate the sequestration. So if we link the carbon credits with the climate goals and the net zero, if we capture carbon, but it's released, we can never get the net zero or reduce the temperature, achieve the temperature goals. So
Yeah.
that's a problem.
I mean, maybe just to say what I can see happening in a lot of the sort of international or national EU and UK level is talking about making conservative estimates. So the BSI new standards coming out, they talk about conservative estimates, i.e. you're kind of you're not trying to game it to see what's highest. You're actually going, well, this is probably the minimum the amount it's doing. Another thing is around having buffers. So you pay for this amount of credits, but there's actually more. Well, so there's more offtake projects than you pay for. So you have this sort of buffer. So you're kind of assuming that at some point some will be reversed or not permanent for various other reasons. And so you've got a larger pool than you actually need or than you've given the credits for. So that means that you can kind of, if some get reversed for climate or for behavioural change or because the farmers' incentive systems change, then you've got this sort of buffer zone. So there's kind of fudges being worked into the system as it's rapidly moving forward.
Okay, good. Well, if anyone has any other questions for us about the core project, we're going to be around the rest of the day. And also check out our website. I think Krista asked for like a take-home message. I think for us, it's really about the integration of all of these different aspects. You can't do one without the other. And you can see that the markets are moving before some of this other stuff. And investigating them all in tandem is really, really important. I think that's kind of the main take-home message from us.
Wonderful information-packed session. Thank you very much, and it is a complex area. We are now going to move to a finance panel, and we're extremely lucky to have three speakers who are from the OECD, from the UN, and from the private sector. So Paul and Joe, I'm wondering if you'd like to come and sit up. You met Joe last night, who was our keynote speaker at dinner, and is the director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD. in addition to the roles that she's previously played as New Zealand's Ambassador for Climate Change and chairing the process, as you heard this morning. Paul is the founder and executive director of Topo Finance, which was really catalysed by quite a pioneering discovery. I met Paul during New York Climate Week a couple of years ago and was really taken when he presented the discovery that some of the really largest companies in the world, like Google and Microsoft, were committed to being net zero, but in fact their banking and investing, Scope 3, were being lent on to fossil fuel companies and creating significant emissions. So Paul, that was, as you know, we've stayed in touch. That was a real takeaway for me. So very interesting to see how this innovative work in the private sector can really begin to galvanise new ways of looking at things. And then finally, Jessica Smith from the United Nations Environment Programme, who will be joining us online and heads the nature program there. She has played a pivotal role in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the associated task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And as you know, we're seeing a lot more synergy, luckily, between biodiversity and greenhouse gas emissions issues and bringing those together. So Jessica was also very involved in the origination of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. We've all heard about Mark Carney and GFANS, so now we have the TNFD as well. So a really interesting, diverse panel, and because we're a little short on time, I'm not going to come up and do more introductions. I'm just going to stand up and wave so they know when they're getting near to their time, and we'll roll from one to the other. So Joe, if you'd like to use the podium, it is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Amanda. And I think this is great, this finance panel. I've been to innumerable COPs, and just about everyone has been billed as a finance COP. And it's true, because we're not going to get change at the speed and scale we need unless the finance is flowing in the right direction. But I think the feeling now is that there are so many blockages in the way that there's a lot that needs to be done, a fundamental restructure. I'm just going to touch on 3 very recent reports from the OECD that I think deal with this issue, and then probably finish with a reference to an earlier report, but I'll try and be very brief. So I talked last night about the new report we released on the 10th of June, Investing in Climate for Growth and Development, that was making the economic case for enhanced NDCs. And that one, as I said, we developed a scenario called Enhanced NDCs. It is a scenario aligned with the Paris Agreement's temperature goals, and found that it would increase global GDP by 0.2% by 2040, compared with what would happen under the current policy scenario. We also factored in, as I mentioned last night, the very significant additional gains that would be made through avoided climate damages by 2100. And it's very important to remember that this is not something that is automatic. It needs to be done through a very carefully coordinated governmental approach. And it depends on NDCs that are not only ambitious on paper, but also are going to be implementable and investable in practice. So we identified 3 building blocks for closing that implementation gap on NDCs. First, the NDC itself creates signalling elements, conveying a country's overall ambition and the direction of travel. Super important. Then those directions of travel have to be underpinned by very credible pathways, policy pathways that translate targets into action. And third building block is to have strong governance arrangements and inclusive stakeholder engagement. From that, we identified 5 priority actions for government. And I think it's really important to emphasise that this is about coordinated and integrated action. First, there has to be political ownership across government. Too often, it's environment ministries that are off to one side, developing climate targets and so on, and it's not a united position across government. So that really you have to bring in finance ministers, national planning, and so on. Make sure there is that broad political ownership. The second one is to align NDCs with national and local development priorities. So if you've got a national development plan, make sure it's tied in. Third, you need to put affected stakeholders at the centre of the transition, and I think that refers back to the social session we had earlier. Fourthly, super important to engage the private sector from the outset, because the private sector is going to be it's going to come up with the lion's share of the finance needed. And finally, public finance is always going to be at the heart, but it can only be at the heart if it's a catalyst and a leverage for domestic and international finance flows so that they can be redirected to climate-aligned activities. So that leads me to move to the second report that I wanted to talk to, and that is the report on mobilising private finance. Move to my right page. Here we are. Aligning finance with climate goals. So those of you who are familiar with the Paris Agreement know that Article 2(1)(c) calls for all finance flows to be aligned with the climate goals under the Paris Agreement. So last year, at the end of last year, the OECD put out a report on the extent to which these finance flows are currently aligned. And we've heard a bit about grey before, grey literature, but there's a big area of grey in this as well. There's a lack of standards, there's a lack of interoperability, and there's a very high risk of greenwashing at the moment as you know, individual firms or governments are kind of self-electing what they consider to be compatible or not. The report we put out found that there's limited evidence, but from what we found, there's a continued overall very low alignment of finance with climate change mitigation goals. And 3 nice little figures for you. Global real economy investments in clean energy surpassed those for fossil fuels in 2022, that's great, but were less than 6% of total investments. In 2022, low-carbon energy supply accounted for only 4% of global listed equity, and that compared with 10% for fossil fuel supply. And we know that banks continue to finance fossil fuel supply heavily, with an estimated $1 trillion allocated in 2022, and that was compared with 0.7 trillion for low-carbon energy. So there's a lot of actions that need to flow from that. Some of it is around mandatory disclosure requirements that are interoperable across jurisdictions. I would say that is number one. Getting better and more accessible granular input data and revising policies in order to incentivise and enable domestic and international finance flows heading in the right direction. Now I'm going to lose the right page again. But I'll move quickly on, if I've got time, to the third report, which is basically coming out as we speak. We produced this mobilising private finance for development, climate and biodiversity in emerging markets and developing economies, financing our futures. We've just put that out in the Financing for Development conference being held in hot Sevilla right at the moment. And there we've partnered with other parts of the OECD to look at what needs to be done, because basically mobilising private finance is stagnating. It's happening, but it's not really growing, and it's not growing fast enough. And despite high-level political commitments, they remain far below what is needed. So we highlight 3 specific areas where the international community has to act decisively to scale up private finance for climate, biodiversity and development. And I think it's really important, as we've just been hearing, to look at these environmental challenges as a whole and how they are interconnected. The first thing might sound pretty simple and basic, but it is a fundamental amount, and that's to build trust through better transparency, closing the data gap. Because private investors often perceive developing economies as high-risk environments, partly influenced by the lack of data on investment performance, risks and returns, and so on. So when you've got high perceived risk, that increases financing costs and ultimately discourages investment. So we really need to focus on that one. The second action we ask for is around embedding private finance mobilisation at the core of development finance. It's not at the moment. It's happening a bit, but it's not. And third is to tackle the policy and regulatory barriers in advanced, emerging and developing economies. In developing economies, high levels of real or perceived risks, the high financing and the transaction costs, the shallow domestic capital markets and difficulties in accessing global finance, all there's indebtedness, there's fiscal constraints, there's capacity limitations, all of that really limits and deters capital flows. So there needs to be local policy reform and international alignment that go hand in hand to foster investment for sustainable development in those economies at a sufficient scale and pace. We know there are some really good finance models, blended finance in particular, like guarantees, insurance, structured funds, but they remain underutilised. And in 2023, official development finance interventions mobilised only 70 billion of private finance, so there's a long way to go there. My last quick point is not a recent report from the OECD, but each year the OECD and IEA put out numbers looking at the levels of fossil fuel support or subsidy. And these have skyrocketed in recent years. We, unlike some of the other, I think IMF is one that prices in externalities, we only look at fiscal support. And only looking at fiscal support saw fossil fuel support reach $1.7 trillion US dollars in 2022, thanks to energy price rises sparked by the war in Ukraine, and dropped, but was still above $1 trillion US dollars in 2023. So if that's not sending the most bizarre kind of contradictory signals to the market, I don't know what is. I'll stop there.
Thank you all for your attention today. I'm here to talk about a slightly different part of finance. This would be sort of the private market side of this. So a couple of quick questions here before we get started. Who here thinks that like where you bank or the money market funds that you buy are interesting, like exciting, fun things to think about in general? Show of hands, yeah, like 1.5. Yeah, that's about right. So hopefully we'll change that after this. And I'm going to make a pretty bold claim here. So just to also, if you're working on a climate solution, which I imagine all of you are based on being here, raise your hand if financing is one of the major problems you face in terms of scale and long-term success. Everybody here. Okay, so what we're trying to do today in this conversation is to sort of marry these two things together. And so the argument that I would make, and I should back up by saying that I am not a finance person. I do work now in finance and live in the state of Connecticut. So those who know the United States, that's not exactly a compliment. But this is just a weird world that I've sort of entered through this opportunity of trying to follow impact and trying to figure out how to create systemic change at real. So this is the bold claim to make in a room full of scientists and technologists, but what if I told you that the innovation most needed to avert a climate crisis wasn't technological, it's not futuristic, it's not big or sexy, we don't get to go visit it or have a ribbon cutting. It's actually this very boring, very unsexy thing called financial products and services. Not something that we often think about, but in my day-to-day, this is our world, and as we know, there's about $200 trillion that we need to be investing in climate solutions by 2050 in order to keep on track with our global climate goals, which we're already sort of blowing past, but that money is not going to come from governments. Some of it will, but the majority of it won't. But there's an opportunity that actually our everyday financial management for organizations, individuals, and companies could be a major lever in moving all of this forward. So historically, and I put myself very much in this category, I have not thought of my banking and investing as a climate, I've always thought of it as this climate neutral activity. When I moved to Seattle 10 years ago, and I live in Connecticut now, but when I moved there, which was a much more exciting move, I essentially, I did everything that I could to be sustainable. I got my 7th generation soaps, and I got an apartment that was, LEED certified, did all these other things that you're supposed to do as an environmentalist. And then I walked down the street and I opened up a Chase bank account. Little did I know at the time that that was the most important climate decision that I was going to make. So to explain how this works, you as an individual or a company or an organization put your money in the bank. We've often treated that the money just sits there like in a black box, essentially. But that's not actually what happens. Our banks take our money and they lend it out across the economy. It goes to everything. It's what funds the real economy. It goes to local businesses that are trying to scale. It goes to home mortgages. It also, unfortunately, a lot of it goes to the oil and gas industry as well. And some of it and more of it is starting to flow to climate solutions at scale. So to kind of just take a step back, and some of these numbers were brought up yesterday, but when we look at this in this sort of macro aggregate standpoint, we have spent a lot of money, of our own money, like your money that you put in the bank, your company's money that you put in the bank, going and flowing towards the world's most carbon-intensive sectors. So over the last 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, $7.9 trillion have flowed to the oil and gas industry through the world's 65 largest banks. Collectively, there's over $22 trillion of exposure to the world's most carbon-intensive sectors. And this thing is something that nobody thinks about. I go talk to corporate treasurers all the time, and they are shocked when they find out that the bulk of these emissions are not actually coming from all of the electronic transfers and all of that stuff that it takes. It turns out that how banks lend our money, this was a study done by CDP, is 700 times more carbon-intensive than everything else banks do combined. So these are big, scary numbers. But what does this mean for you, your organization, or your company? We've had data like this for a while, but we were always trying to figure out, well, how do I make this relevant to you as an individual or you as an organization? And if you think about it in another sector, like if you knew how much Toyota, how many cars they produced a year, it wouldn't help you figure out, how fuel efficient is my car? Is this other car more fuel efficient? How much better is an ICE vehicle? And that's where we've really been in the banking space. And so we set out in 2021 to actually develop a novel methodology for tracking carbon as it moves through the financial system. So every dollar as it moves through the financial system generates a carbon footprint. And that carbon footprint will vary dramatically based on what it's being lent to. And then we designed a novel methodology to actually tie that back to the consumer. And so this is one last sort of big macro stat here. But what we didn't know was at the time 20 to 30%, sorry, and I should apologize, I'm speaking to a global audience today. A lot of these stats are based on US banks and US companies, so apologies for that. But for major US banks, so these are your big Wall Street banks, 20 to 30% of all of your money that the bank is lending out goes to the world's most carbon-intensive sectors. And so that's energy production, utilities, mining, et cetera. And what we started to do, as Amanda set out, so as I jokingly say, as Bill McKibben's, he's telling me that where I bank matters, and I'm poor and I run a small nonprofit and I have like $5,000 in my bank account. What does that mean for a company like Apple or Google or Microsoft, all of whom have tens of billions, if not north of $100 billion in their bank accounts? And what we found, and this is a lot of numbers, the key one to look at is the one on the left, or excuse me, the right in the red. And so the first column is what these companies report as their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. The second column is what we have, using public data, been able to develop as their estimated financed emissions. So this is the money coming from their cash and investments, not their outside investments or anything like that, just the money that they have in banks and short-term investments. And the most important number is this third red number there, which is what percentage their banking emissions are compared to everything else they're doing. And so as you can see for all of these companies, it ranges dramatically. Visa down at the bottom with over 1,000% of their emissions. So that means their banking emissions are 10 times all of their operational and indirect emissions. And then even for a company like Amazon that has a massive carbon footprint, banking and investing is their third largest source of emissions. And when we started going and talking to companies, to a company, none of them had any idea what we were talking about. I'll never forget we were talking to Apple, and we basically just said, well, do you think of your banking and investing as a supply chain that you should work to decarbonize? And they sort of all nervously looked around the Zoom camera at each other. And then finally somebody piped up and said, no, that's interesting. We have never thought about that before. And it's like, well, you have $191 billion in cash and investments that are generating more emissions than everything else you're doing combined. So it's time to get started. And so that's what we've been doing. Over the last 4 years, we've been working with many of the world's largest companies in the US and Europe to start treating their banking and investing as a supply chain that they should be working to decarbonize. And it's really important to note that this isn't just a lot of new emissions that we're finding in the economy, but this is actually undermining the climate work of a lot of these companies, because what their money that as they deposit in the banks is being lent in ways that is directly undermining all of their work throughout their scope 3 emissions particularly, but it is really having this very pervasive sort of impact on their downstream emissions particularly. So it's always fun to get to pick on Tesla. So this is numbers, and sorry if any of you own a Tesla, but not sorry, in 2025. This data was from 2023, and so we developed this data ourselves. So just to show you the scale of all of this. So in 2023, Tesla sold about 1.8 million Teslas worldwide. Based on the emissions, and they do not report actually how many emissions they save, but using some average data, we were able to calculate that they're saving about 6 million tons of emissions per year per that 1.8 million cars they sold. But that year alone, their financed emissions exceeded that. So everything they did that year to sell cars, you could argue, was undermined by the amount of emissions stemming from their banking and investing. And if you own a Rivian, it's like 20 times worse because they sell a lot less cars. So this isn't to call out Tesla, although, like I said, fun to do in 2025. But this is really just to show how big this is and how hidden this is as an emission source. And so if you start factoring this in more globally, and you look at all companies in the United States alone, so there's over $7 trillion sitting in cash and investments in the bank accounts of companies in the United States. The emissions generated from that represents about 20% of all emissions in the United States. And so if you start thinking about what you could be doing if you start thinking about your money as, as I say, sort of Microsoft has this $1 billion climate innovation fund. It's great. They fund all of these new exciting technologies, hopefully stuff that you all are working on. But meanwhile, they're sitting on $110 billion in cash and investments that's generating twice as much emissions than everything they're doing, and they've never even thought to apply a climate lens to it. So it creates a massive opportunity for new funding and new opportunities to create new financial products and vehicles that can help accelerate the decarbonization of the global economy. And also, to frankly, use your customer power as the biggest customers of these banks to hold banks accountable for how they're lending their money, their disclosures, which are horrible, in terms of how much emissions they're disclosing. If you look at what Apple's policies are versus the banks that they have in terms of their disclosure, it's a massive, massive delta. And it's the one, I had to fill out a thing. We're working with a company, they wanted to pay us, and the emissions, they asked us about our emissions, but they've never asked about their bank's emissions before. And so I think I'm getting sort of the clock here. So just to show, so this is data that we pulled together for the US. This is just to show on an individual standpoint that the average American, if they were to move about $15,000, these are indicative emissions, important to note, and indirect, it's even larger than switching to an EV every year. So as Amanda noted, our work has been very nicely called the sort of helping found the largest source of emissions left in the economy. But the most important part of this quote is that we can actually do something swiftly about this. So my organization, Topo Finance, a nonprofit, we are working to create a world in which all companies, organizations, and individuals leverage their banking and investing as their new climate power. If you need help with any of this, we are continuing to conduct pioneering research. This year alone, we'll consult with companies with over $50 billion in cash and investments. We're launching our first financial products in the fall that will help reduce emissions by 80% and increase your returns by 4x, which we are very excited about. That's for individuals based in the U.S. But we are just at the beginning of this journey. I would say that as I sort of to pull this all together to the beginning, like we need a new explosion of this work. There are not nearly enough, there's a lot of energy that's thinking about how we do project finance, but not nearly enough thinking about how we actually build new financial products that work for everyday individuals, companies, and organizations to help them manage their money in ways that align with how they bank and how they invest that also will be decarbonizing the planet. And so I am getting the second sign to wrap up, so I'm wrapping up. If you have any questions, you can reach me at paul@topofinance.org, and you can learn more about our work at topofinance.org.
Super. So I lead nature at the UNEP Finance Initiative, and I wanted to focus a little bit on banks as well. So I think Joe and Paul queued that up really well for me. And can banks make a contribution to net zero through a nature positive strategy? So at UNEPify, we're a hybrid between private finance and the aspirations and commitments that are made at the UN. So we have 380 signatories now to the Principles for Responsible Banking, who represent well over half of the world's banking assets, and about 250 insurers, reinsurers, and other supporting institutions who signed the Principles for Sustainable Insurance. And we work with hundreds of investors through different platforms, specifically those who would like to be sustainability leaders. And our membership is, I would say, heavily geared to Europe if you look at the number of signatories, but if you look at the assets under management, around half are based in Asia. And right now, our top jurisdiction for signatories from the banking sector is actually China. So at London Climate Action Week, I was really pleased to be celebrating with a number of Chinese banks. So in our nature work, we work about 70% directly with financial institutions, especially banks, insurers, investors, and about 30% on systems change, including in the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP. We convened the finance days, and we wrote the roadmap, and we write the report cards asking if the financial sector is on track. So there is kind of an interplay between what financial institutions are able to do and then feeding that back into the policymakers and trying to embed approaches that are proving promising. And although there is a backlash to financial institutions addressing net zero, and I would say that's a limited but powerful jurisdiction where that's mainly happening, financial institutions actually continue to work on these topics, I would say, more quietly. And the business case for dealing with nature is very much tied to the physical risks, which are inevitable and which are also reported on every year in the WEF risk report. But they really present challenges to financial institutions who want to be around in the future. There's also an inverse relationship between the diversity of the GDP in a country and the exposure to these types of risks. So if you were in a more diversified economy, for example, the Netherlands, the whole banking sector is exposed around 37% to nature risk. And if you're in a less diversified economy like Mauritius, the number is as high as 72%. On the other hand, there's a lot of opportunities from addressing nature in your financial portfolio. So the WEF estimated there's around 10 trillion of annual business opportunities and 395 million new jobs possible through different transition pathways that deal with nature. At the same time, I was listening in earlier on the social panel, there is a justice angle here. So currently, Indigenous peoples are stewarding an outsized share of the world's remaining intact biodiversity. And not only are they largely not supported for that, they're often persecuted as environmental defenders. So there needs to be really a reorientation of this relationship. And linking it back to the net zero topic, around 23% of the irrecoverable carbon, so the carbon that if we lose it, we won't be able to get it back by 2030, is actually stored within protected areas. A lot of it is in critical ecosystems, and around a third of that carbon is managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So at UNEP, we like to highlight that the number one priority is maintaining the carbon that is already sequestered in ecosystems to get us to net zero. And the Paris Agreement actually does have an article on this. It's not one that's very actioned or highly known, but it is there that parties should be acting to hold carbon in ecosystems before looking at restoration. And then we have a lot of different work targeted to the financial sector on how you can actually increase mitigation potential through nature-based solutions. So there is a win-win, and I heard Amanda in the opening mentioning the case of New Zealand, where there was an unfortunate lose-lose situation with the New Zealand plantations that were damaging ecosystem services and having social impact by not considering these topics together. And this is critical that we deal with these sustainability issues in tandem. So we're actually seeing evidence in academic journals that banks are seeing share price boosts. Those that are dealing positively with biodiversity are seeing a statistically significant boost, including around the UN biodiversity COP negotiations. And then another paper showed the inverse, that companies that have large biodiversity footprints are getting a share price penalty in the market. So it's starting to show financial materiality. And our research that we released last year showed private finance for nature has grown around 11x over the past 4 years. So this is 1 year ago, and we've seen a lot of progress in the interim. There are challenges with this, though. Many communities say, where is this money going? Is it actually reaching projects on the front line? A lot of it is actually finance that's, maybe mitigating nature impact, or it's supporting transition, but it's not heading towards restoration or conservation projects. So there is quite a definitional issue that we need to get over so that we have aligned expectations. And then the financial sector, they're quite afraid to be accused of greenwash. So there is a concern from the financial sector of putting out products that are badged for nature, that they will have some form of backlash. So we are working with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation on a working model. So this is a working model that we released at New York Climate Week last year. And now we have a 2-year project to create a theoretical model and an operating model. So the theoretical model, we're aiming for a journal paper. And the operating model, we're aiming for really detailed guidance that's interoperable between banking and investment, so that we do have a common view. So this is a large consultation process that is kicking off. And I want to highlight just on the bottom here, the monitoring of contributions to positive outcomes. Our view as UNEP is that we shouldn't necessarily celebrate financial institutions who are creating, one-off small niche products, which are, heading towards positive impact for nature, but ignoring the full impact of their entire portfolios. So WWF has something in the Bloomberg terminal called the More Harm Than Good Index. And this is really meant to be calling out greenwashing if financial institutions are doing a look over their strategy at, a small number of niche products, but not, for example, looking at their entire portfolio. So for us, financial institutions should be looking at the whole of their portfolio and also looking towards supporting broad economic transition. So not only sort of niche products that support conservation or restoration, but looking at the bulk of where harm is being driven to nature. So the HALT is key in the HALT and reverse 2030 nature target. I also want to mention that we do have projects that are supporting nature-related finance. So we do have a project that's supported by the Moore Foundation to work across emerging markets where there are positive examples of nature-related finance and work on scaling them. So this project specifically has a $200 million financial target, and this should be supporting countries to get financing for delivering parts of their national biodiversity strategy and action plans. So I wanted to just share some reflections, not with a slide, but just verbally in this context, that there, as I mentioned, there has been a backlash to the financial sector dealing with net zero. There are potential spin-off benefits to dealing with the trajectory to nature positive, including stopping the damage to ecosystems that are sequestering nature and to affirming the rights of communities who defend those critical ecosystems. So it's not a full strategy to reach net zero, but there are various studies that show, up to 37%, and that's a number that we're losing quickly, of our Paris Agreement solutions can come from nature. So the financial institutions that we work with, we are encouraging them to not only have net zero strategies, but also have full, robust nature strategies as part of the aim to get us towards carbon neutral economies that are also supporting healthy and just livelihoods. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you all. So it really gives us a sense of optimism that finance can be a lever for change. Any comments?
Thank you to all the presenters. Really great presentations, and quite mind-blowing in some regards. So I've sort of got two linked questions. Firstly, pivoting from Jessica's opening slide to yours at Topo. If we've got 50% of banks worldwide aligned with the responsible investor principles, and yet that is the carbon footprint of those banking practices, are they actually implementing those principles? And also, do you have a version of that presentation that you could use for like public consumption? How do I change my individual banking? Because I would love to show it at lots of communities. So.
Jessica, do you want to go first? Have we lost you? Paul, while we're getting Jessica back.
She can't hear with you unless you've got a microphone, I think.
Oh, Jessica, questions for you. Can you answer?
Maybe she's gone.
She's gone.
Yeah, so the question around are banks implementing this? Some are not. It's all going relatively slowly. I would say there's a really big divide between European banks and US banks. Coming out of Glasgow, we had GFANZ of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and a lot of the major U.S. banks have dropped out of that as a result of the sort of anti-ESG fervor in the United States. You are seeing leading banks in Europe like BNP Paribas moving forward with a lot of this. I would say the pace is not very fast. I mean, it's hard. You're trying to change, a company that has, $3 trillion in assets under management in the case of a company like a bank like Chase. I mean, that's a big part of the work that we're doing is that these banks very rarely hear from companies. And so just to throw a quick stat, and this is a little bit outdated, but basically Microsoft has more money in their pension funds with BlackRock than every state who has sued BlackRock and blacklisted BlackRock has lost. So that, granted Microsoft can't pull them in front of like the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, but as far as the financial pressure, that's sort of the lever that we're trying to pull is to get consumers, big companies, organizations to start really sort of putting pressure on their banks because and holding them accountable for that because right now there's very little accountability because these are all voluntary disclosures. We were going to be releasing, so the data that we have there, a lot of that's in our report. You can find on our website, Carbon Bank Report. Happy to send this information to anybody. We have a calculator for the U.S. If you go to topofinance.com/calculator, but we are releasing a global banking evaluation system that'll have the biggest banks in the U.S. and Europe and have sort of a holistic analysis of their environmental performance that we'll be putting out ahead of Climate Week in New York.
I think, Jessica, you're back with us now. The question that was asked, the question that was asked is, so if so many banks have signed up to the responsible investment principles, how come they're not compliant with it?
What's the evidence that they're not complying with it?
Paul's presentation pretty much blew it out of the water, didn't it?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I think Paul's presentation rather made the point that they're really not investing responsibly, even though they might be signed up to doing so.
Okay, I think that's, I would say each of them has a plan with targets that have been set with the principles that have been agreed in the alliances that they're part of, and they're all going through an annual review to see if they are complying. So I wouldn't, I'm not going to defend any particular bank, but, I think there is a lag between, they join, they have to assess, they have to set priorities, they put policies in place. Some of them are screening policies where they, certainly won't invest in certain areas anymore. Some of them are transition planning opportunities that they're going through with their clients. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they're not complying. I would say there's a time lag. There may also be gaps in certain products that are covered by the principles, and then other product types are not. So that's another topic, but I wouldn't say I wouldn't call that non-compliant.
All right, so it's interesting. So the point you're making, and interested, Paul, in your response, is that they just haven't thought about it, where their investments are going, in terms of their own compliance.
I wouldn't say they haven't thought about it. I would say each of the banks has been going through their processes with the guidelines that they have. And, it takes time to decarbonize your portfolio. It's not simply, snap your finger. These are large investments in large sectors that are, it takes time to, completely alter our economy. So if you're talking about a group of banks that invest, half the world's banking assets, that doesn't change overnight.
No, quite a joke.
I just wanted to ask a supplementary question, Your Honour, and that is, are these banks all operating to the same standards? Because if they're not, that could well, thank you, that could well have an influence on the outcome you're seeing.
Yeah, so there was a standard that was set by the Net Zero Banking Alliance. A lot of the major U.S. and Canadian banks have now pulled out of that alliance, and so they're no longer these are all voluntary standards anyway. I think there's a really important piece of how domestic policy plays into this, and so why in part you're seeing the leadership in Europe is also because the policy regime in Europe is a lot better. I talked to the head of sustainability for one of Canada's largest banks recently, and the conversation we had was around their funding of pipelines, and she said, well, if the Trudeau government authorizes these pipelines, we Bank Canada, so we're going to finance the pipeline. What are we supposed to do? Not do that? And it's an unfortunately sound argument to be making. And so there's a real policy piece. And so in the US, where the policy has moved back, the banks have moved back. In Europe, where the policy is moving forward, the banks are moving forward in tandem with that. It's happening, and as was appropriately noted, this is a very, very big and complicated problem. And so this isn't something that you can just flip a switch and stop. I would argue personally that they're not exactly putting their full might into it in most of these banks. They're not treating it like the existential crisis that it is. And that's in part why it needs to be coming from consumers to convey that this is the existential crisis it is, because they can move faster, even in places like the US where the policy isn't necessarily aligning. It's not just about not investing in the good stuff. It's also about investing. It's not just about not investing in dirty energy. It's also about ramping up investments in clean energy. And in the U.S., according to Bloomberg, we need to hit by 2030, we need to be at a 4-to-1 ratio for the world's largest banks. Banks like BNP is already at 3-to-1 or 3.25 to 1, I believe. The major U.S. banks are closer to 0.8 to 1. And so there's nothing. So that sort of just gives you a good indication of kind of some of the differences there.
Yeah, I did have a question actually as well, and you kind of touched on it, and it was about pensions, so that's one thing to maybe explain a bit more. The other one is from a UK perspective, we have a legally blinding Climate Change Act to create net zero by 2050, right? So if our banks in the UK are investing in stuff that will necessarily mean emissions post-2050, wouldn't that also be an illegal act?
I can't speak to the legality of that because I'm not familiar with the rules of the road there. It's important to note that when it comes to sort of the regulatory side of this, it is a lot of carrots and not so many sticks when it comes to this. And so that's part of the big challenge of what this looks like down the road, and that's why you need to sort of match up the policy side of what governments are investing in, what the commitments are, and sort of with what the banks are doing. And so to give that Canadian example, I do know that the high street banks are very carbon intensive. A lot of them are trending in the right direction, but I'm not sure it's matching the speed and scale of the UK as a whole.
Actually, I was going to feed back to Martin, but he's left the room, so maybe I'll tell him over lunch. But it's just that the legal requirement is on the UK government to deliver, and it's on net zero within our boundaries. So a lot of these investments are actually international. But I think from a consumer point of view, is that where do I find... I'm interested in you say this report's coming out, because it's like, how do I choose these financial products and how do I know they're really investable? I know we did a arts project at the university and then tried to get people to sign up to pensions that didn't invest in deforestation. I know at University of Bristol we've done a lot of looking at divestment from fossil fuel stuff, and I suppose universities tend to be driven by what our students have a very strong moral and ethical push towards us. So yeah, I guess for me it's how can I know what I trust what I'm investing in? I'm happy to have a lower return knowing that it's not going to fossil fuels, but how do I genuinely know that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a bit, the one critique I have is that it's we sort of tend to think of these things, and it's interesting, it sort of creates this false choice that you can either have yield or you can have impact, and you can't necessarily have both, but that's not necessarily the case. A lot of these green funds are actually outperforming traditional funds, and so I just want to sort of dispel that myth that by going green on your banking, you need, or you're investing, you're going to have a lower return. That's not necessarily true. So, there's one great resource, sorry, I neglected to mention, that is UK-based. It's called My Mother Tree, so they do calculate the emissions for the UK banks, and it is geared towards individuals, so I did want to highlight that. One other just important thing to note, so historically, when we've talked about this, it's been very much through the lens of divestment. That's very much around screening out certain industries and sectors, particularly when it comes to equities, and so you're talking about stocks and taking it out of portfolios. That doesn't get you towards net zero. It just gets you not investing in necessarily or having ownership shares in the most carbon intensive stuff. And so we need to be reframing this around decarbonization. Just because you've divested, you could still have a relatively large carbon footprint. There are other things like industrial manufacturing that has nothing to do with fossil fuels directly, but is a very carbon-intensive sector. And so we need to be thinking about this more through the lens of how do we start drawing down. So it's really about ramping up investments in the good stuff, drawing down investments in the bad stuff, and then moving our money to decarbonize everything else. And so you look at a company like Google, they have over last time I looked, over $60 billion in corporate debt. What is that corporate debt that they own? They probably have never, I know they have never applied a climate lens to it. A lot of it is things like Saudi Aramco and things like that. But what if that was instead going to be bonds that were going to decarbonize companies in the Europe or in the global south? Like, there's a real opportunity, and that's where a lot of the innovation needs to come in on that product side, is if you actually look at what's called a 10K, which is where these companies report their annual, how much money they have in cash and investments. What that actually is a roadmap for how do you decarbonize the planet, because it's treasury bonds in there, it's municipal bonds in there, it's housing bonds in there, it's corporate bonds in there, and it's cash that's flowing to the real economy. And so if you start building alternatives for that, you have a roadmap for decarbonization.
Fantastic. This has been a great panel. We have a very interesting excursion at lunchtime, so we're 5 minutes over. We can continue this conversation for those who are going to stay. Otherwise, hope you can catch them later this afternoon. And I'm very excited now to introduce you to our excursion leader.
Hi everyone, my name's Roz. I'm Sustainability Manager for Biodiversity at the University of Exeter. And what we were planning to do this lunchtime, if anyone would like to come, is walk down to the Lower Hoopin Valley, which is a county wildlife site just to the south of campus. That we're lucky enough to own and manage, and we're currently managing to enhance biodiversity, the natural capital and ecosystem services it provides, and also to enhance community access and engagement and research as well. It is quite warm out there. We will walk down the hill at a gentle pace, but we do have to walk back up. So, yep, anyone is welcome to join. The path is a little bit rough in places as well, just to let you know. But anyone who'd like to come on that, please do.
Okay. And I think we've got permission from Sarah for those who go on the excursion to bring their lunch in and eat while the next panel starts. So don't feel constrained that it's an either-or decision. Thanks again to our wonderful panel, and thank you, Roz. Great, so we'll come in.